Hi, I'm Sarah. They laughed when the lawyer read my name for the old shed and 5 acres of worthless desert land. My cousin Jennifer smirked. My uncle Marcus rolled his eyes. And my Aunt Patricia actually whispered figures under her breath. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But when that same lawyer cleared his throat and mentioned the mineral rights that came with those 5 acres, their laughter died faster than a candle in a hurricane. What they didn't know was that beneath that worthless patch of Texas dirt lay enough black gold to change everything. And I mean everything. The law office of Henderson, Walsh Associates sat on the corner of Main and Cedar like a fortress of mahogany and tradition, its brass nameplate weathered by decades of West Texas wind and sun. I pulled my beat-up Honda Civic into the parking lot, feeling every eye from the gleaming Mercedes and BMW sedans already lined up like soldiers. My hands trembled slightly as I turned off the engine, the silence amplifying the doubt that had been gnawing at me since I'd received the call 3 days earlier. "Miss Sarah Reynolds? This is Patricia Walsh from Henderson Walsh Associates. We need you to come in for the reading of your grandmother's will." Grandmother. The words still felt foreign on my tongue. Evelyn Hartwell had been more myth than family member to me, a woman whose existence I'd only learned about 6 months before her death, when my mother, in a rare moment of honesty fueled by too much wine, had let slip that her own mother was still alive. For 28 years, I'd believed both my grandparents were dead. For 28 years, I'd been told that my mother's family had disowned her when she married my father, a struggling mechanic from the wrong side of Dallas. For 28 years, I'd carried the weight of being unwanted by people I'd never even met. Now, sitting in that parking lot, smoothing down the wrinkles in my only decent dress, a navy blue number I'd bought at Target for job interviews, I wondered what I was even doing here. The call had been brief, professional, revealing nothing about why a grandmother who'd never acknowledged my existence would suddenly remember me in death. My mother had died 2 years earlier from complications related to her diabetes, taking most of our family history with her to the grave. My father had passed when I was 15, leaving behind more debt than memories. I was, for all practical purposes, alone in the world. The law office lobby was everything I'd expected and nothing I was prepared for. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over leather furniture that probably cost more than I made in 3 months working double shifts at Miller's Diner. The receptionist, a woman with silver hair pulled back in a perfect chignon, looked up from her computer with the kind of practiced smile that never quite reached the eyes. "You must be Sarah Reynolds," she said, her voice carrying just a hint of surprise, as if my appearance didn't quite match whatever expectations had been set. "They're waiting for you in the conference room. Down the hall, last door on your right." Walking down that hallway felt like approaching my own execution. My shoes, comfortable flats with worn soles, made no sound on the thick carpet. But I felt exposed nonetheless, hyper-aware of every detail that marked me as different from whatever family I was about to meet. Through the glass walls of various offices, I caught glimpses of expensive suits and polished shoes, the uniform of people who belonged in places like this. The conference room door was heavier than it looked, requiring more force than I'd anticipated. When it swung open, 5 pairs of eyes turned toward me with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed disdain. At the head of a table that could have seated 20, a distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes, stood to greet me. "Miss Reynolds, I'm Jonathan Walsh." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "Thank you for coming." His handshake was firm, warm, genuine in a way that immediately set him apart from the others in the room. "Please have a seat wherever you're comfortable." The only empty chair sat directly across from a woman who could only be my Aunt Patricia, given the way she'd been staring at me since I walked in. She was perhaps 55, with blonde hair that owed more to expensive salon treatments than nature, and jewelry that caught the light every time she moved. Her expression suggested she'd smelled something unpleasant the moment I entered the room. To her left sat a man I assumed was her husband, Marcus, based on the matching wedding band and the way he kept glancing at her for cues on how to react. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of tan that came from golf courses rather than honest work, and eyes that assessed everything in terms of dollar signs. His suit probably cost more than my monthly rent. Their daughter Jennifer sat beside him, a carbon copy of her mother in younger form, though her contempt was less refined, more openly displayed. She was maybe 32, with the kind of perfect makeup and manicured nails that spoke of a life where appearance was the primary occupation. Her husband, whose name I hadn't caught during the brief introductions, seemed uncomfortable with the whole proceeding, shifting in his seat and avoiding eye contact with everyone. The fifth person in the room was a mystery, an elderly man with weathered hands and a face that spoke of years spent outdoors. He wore a simple brown suit that had seen better decades, and when he nodded at me, there was something almost apologetic in his expression. "Now that we're all here," Mr. Walsh began, settling back into his chair and opening a leather portfolio, "we can proceed with the reading of Evelyn Hartwell's last will and testament. As you all know, Mrs. Hartwell passed away peacefully in her sleep 3 weeks ago, at the age of 87. She was, by all accounts, a remarkable woman who built a substantial legacy through careful planning and shrewd investments." Patricia shifted in her seat, her jewelry catching the light as she leaned forward slightly. The anticipation in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Jennifer's perfectly manicured fingers drummed silently on the table, while Marcus maintained his poker face, though his eyes betrayed his eagerness. "Mrs. Hartwell was very specific about her wishes," Mr. Walsh continued, "and asked me to convey that she thought carefully about each bequest, taking into account both family relationships and individual circumstances." His eyes moved around the table, lingering for a moment on me with something that might have been sympathy. The will reading began with smaller bequests. The elderly man, whose name was Frank Morrison, and who had apparently been Evelyn's neighbor and friend for 40 years, received her vintage Ford pickup truck and a modest sum to cover its maintenance. He accepted this with quiet dignity, thanking the room in general with a voice rough from emotion. Then came the larger items. Patricia received the antique jewelry collection, which, from her satisfied smile, was clearly worth a considerable sum. Marcus was bequeathed a collection of rare books and first editions that made his eyes light up with dollar signs. Jennifer inherited the china cabinet and all its contents, along with the dining room set that had apparently been in the family for generations. With each announcement, I sank deeper into my chair, feeling more and more like an intruder at a feast where I didn't belong. These people had clearly been part of Evelyn's life in ways I never was. They knew her habits, her preferences, her treasures. They belonged here in a way I never could. "Now," Mr. Walsh said, his voice taking on a different tone, "we come to the matter of the real property." The room's attention sharpened, everyone sitting a little straighter. This was clearly what they'd been waiting for. Mrs. Hartwell owned several pieces of property, acquired over many years through various means. He consulted his papers carefully before continuing. "The main residence, a 4-bedroom house on Maple Street, along with its furnishings not previously mentioned, goes to Patricia Hartwell Morrison, along with the responsibility for maintaining the family cemetery plot." Patricia's smile was triumphant, though she tried to maintain a facade of solemn dignity. This had clearly been expected, probably discussed and planned for years. The house was likely worth several $100,000, maybe more depending on the local market. The commercial building downtown, currently leased to Morrison's Hardware, Mr. Walsh continued, and Marcus straightened in his seat, goes to Marcus Morrison, along with all existing lease agreements and rental income. Father and daughter exchanged satisfied glances. The commercial property was probably worth even more than the house, and with existing tenants, it represented ongoing income for life. The 20-acre parcel on the west side of town, including the old barn and equipment shed, goes to Jennifer Morrison Davis. Jennifer's smile was more restrained than her parents', but I could see the satisfaction in her eyes. 20 acres in this part of Texas could be worth a small fortune, especially if there was any development potential. I found myself wondering what I was even doing here. Clearly, the real family had been taken care of, the valuable assets distributed among people who had actually known and cared for Evelyn Hartwell. I was just a curiosity, a loose end to be tied up with some token gesture before everyone could get on with their lives. "Now," Mr. Walsh said, and something in his tone made everyone pay attention. "We come to the final piece of real property." He looked directly at me, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "To Sarah Elizabeth Reynolds, my granddaughter, I leave the 5-acre parcel known as the Old Homestead, including the original farmhouse foundation, the equipment shed, and all structures thereon." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Jennifer laughed, actually laughed out loud. "The Old Homestead? You mean that pile of rocks and weeds out by the highway, with that falling down shed?" She turned to her parents with amusement dancing in her eyes. Grandmother always did have a sense of humor. Patricia's expression was less amused and more relieved. "Well, that's fitting, I suppose. It's not like there's any value out there anyway, just desert and tumbleweeds." Marcus nodded sagely. "Probably cost more to clean up than it's worth. Environmental hazards, you know. Old foundations can have all sorts of problems." I felt my face burning with embarrassment and something deeper, a familiar shame that had followed me through life like a shadow. Even in death, even from a grandmother I'd never known, I was getting the scraps, the leftovers, the piece nobody else wanted. 5 acres of worthless desert with a crumbling shed. It was almost funny in its cruelty. "However," Mr. Walsh said, and the single word cut through the room's dismissive chatter like a sword through silk. "There is one additional matter to address regarding Miss Reynolds: inheritance." The room fell silent again, but this time the quality of the silence was different. Mr. Walsh was looking at his papers with an expression I couldn't quite read, and when he looked up at me there was something almost apologetic in his eyes. "Mrs. Hartwell was very specific about this next item," he said carefully. "Along with the 5-acre parcel, Sarah Elizabeth Reynolds also inherits all mineral rights, oil and gas rights, and subsurface rights associated with said property. These rights were specifically retained by Mrs. Hartwell when she sold the surrounding properties 30 years ago, and they have remained with the homestead parcel ever since." The change in the room's atmosphere was immediate and electric. Patricia's satisfied smile faltered. Marcus sat forward in his chair like a man who'd just heard a distant alarm. Jennifer's laughter died completely, replaced by something that looked almost like panic. "Mineral rights?" Patricia asked, her voice carefully controlled but with an edge I hadn't heard before. "What mineral rights? There's nothing out there but sand and scrub brush." Mr. Walsh consulted his papers again, his professional demeanor never wavering. Mrs. Hartwell was quite thorough in her record-keeping. "The mineral rights to that particular parcel have never been severed from the surface rights. When oil and gas exploration began in this area 15 years ago, several companies approached Mrs. Hartwell about leasing those rights, but she declined all offers." "Oil and gas exploration?" Marcus's voice had taken on a strangled quality. "What oil and gas exploration?" Nobody ever mentioned oil and gas exploration. The Morrison family wouldn't necessarily have been informed. Mr. Walsh explained with professional patience. The exploration was focused on properties several miles from town, and Mrs. Hartwell chose to keep the inquiries private. "However, I have documentation here of at least 6 different companies that expressed interest in the mineral rights to that specific parcel over the past decade." I felt like I was watching this conversation from outside my own body. Mineral rights. Oil and gas. Companies wanting to lease rights to my 5 acres of worthless desert. None of it made sense, but the expressions on my relatives' faces told me it was making perfect sense to them. "But surely," Jennifer said, her voice higher than it had been moments before, "surely if there was any real value there, grandmother would have mentioned it. She would have told us." Mr. Walsh opened another folder, this one thicker than the first. "Mrs. Hartwell left very specific instructions about the mineral rights. She asked me to explain that she spent considerable time researching the geological surveys of the area, and she believed there was significant potential for oil and gas reserves beneath that particular property." He pulled out what looked like a geological survey map, spreading it on the table where everyone could see. The land was marked with various symbols and notations that meant nothing to me, but I could see Marcus studying it with the intensity of a man trying to solve a life-or-death puzzle. According to Mrs. Hartwell's research, Mr. Walsh continued, that 5-acre parcel sits directly above what geologists call a structural dome, a formation that often indicates the presence of oil and gas reserves. The surrounding drilling activity has been moving steadily in that direction, and Mrs. Hartwell believed it was only a matter of time before companies would begin making serious offers for the mineral rights. The room was completely silent now except for the sound of Patricia's breathing, which had become noticeably more rapid. Jennifer was staring at the map like it was written in hieroglyphics, while Marcus had gone pale beneath his golf course tan. What kind of offers? I heard myself ask, my voice sounding strange and distant. Mr. Walsh smiled at me, the first genuine warmth I'd seen from anyone in this room. Well, Miss Reynolds, that's where things get very interesting indeed. Mrs. Hartwell documented every inquiry she received, along with the terms that were offered. The most recent offer, which she received just 2 months before her death, was from Lone Star Energy Corporation. He pulled out another document, this one official-looking with corporate letterhead. They offered a 15% royalty on any oil or gas extracted, plus a signing bonus of $250,000 just for the right to explore. The number hung in the air like a thunderclap. $250,000, just for the right to look. I made $18,000 last year, working every shift I could get at the diner. $250,000 was more money than I could imagine, more money than I'd ever dreamed of having. But judging from the expressions around the table, that was just the beginning. Mrs. Hartwell declined that offer, Mr. Walsh continued, because she felt the terms weren't favorable enough. She believed the property was worth significantly more, and she wanted to ensure that her heir, meaning you, Miss Reynolds, would be in a position to negotiate from strength. Patricia found her voice first, though it came out as little more than a whisper. How much more? Mr. Walsh consulted yet another document. Based on the drilling results from surrounding properties, and taking into account the geological formations specific to that area, Mrs. Hartwell's independent analysis suggested the mineral rights could be worth anywhere from $2 to $5 million, depending on the actual reserves found and the terms of any eventual lease agreement. $5 million. The words echoed in my head like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. $5 million for my 5 acres of worthless desert, with its falling down shed. $5 million that would change everything, that would transform me from a diner waitress living paycheck to paycheck into someone who never had to worry about money again. But more than the money, more than the impossible wealth being described, was the realization of what this meant about my grandmother. She hadn't given me the worthless parcel as an afterthought or a cruel joke. She'd given me the most valuable piece of the entire estate, and she'd done it deliberately, carefully, with thought and planning that spanned years. She'd known exactly what she was doing. There's one more thing, Mr. Walsh said, and I wondered how there could possibly be more. He opened a sealed envelope and pulled out a handwritten letter. Mrs. Hartwell asked me to read this to you personally, Miss Reynolds, after the mineral rights had been explained. He cleared his throat and began to read in a voice that carried the weight of words written by a woman I'd never met, but who had somehow known me better than I'd ever imagined possible. My dear Sarah, if you are hearing this letter, then you have learned the truth about your inheritance, and you are probably feeling confused and overwhelmed. I want you to know that every decision I made regarding your legacy was made with careful thought and deep love for a granddaughter I never had the chance to know. Your mother and I had our differences that kept us apart for far too many years. Pride, stubbornness, and old wounds prevented me from reaching out, while there was still time to build the relationship we should have had. I have regretted that silence every day since learning of her death. But I have been watching you from afar, Sarah. I hired a private investigator 5 years ago to learn about your life, your character, your struggles, and your strength. I know about the jobs you work to support yourself, about the kindness you show to customers at the diner even when they don't deserve it, about the way you've built a life of dignity and purpose, despite having no help from family. I also know about the others who are sitting in that room with you now, the relatives who wrote you off before they ever met you, who assumed that because you weren't raised with money, you must not be worth knowing. They have lived comfortable lives supported by family wealth, but they have never known struggle, never learned the value of hard work, never developed the character that only comes from facing adversity with grace. The mineral rights I'm leaving you are worth more than everything else in this will combined. Use them wisely, Sarah. Use them to build the life you deserve, but more importantly, use them to become the woman I believe you already are. Don't let sudden wealth change your character, but don't let anyone convince you that you don't deserve every bit of good fortune that comes your way. You are a Hartwell, my dear granddaughter, and Hartwells have always been survivors. We've always found a way to turn what others saw as worthless ground into something precious. I have complete faith that you will do the same. With all my love and hope for your future, your grandmother Evelyn. The letter ended, but the silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever. I could feel tears on my cheeks, though I couldn't remember starting to cry. This woman, this stranger who had been my grandmother, had known me in ways my own family never had. She had seen value in me that I'd never seen in myself. Across the table, Patricia's face had gone through several color changes, settling finally on a shade of red that suggested barely controlled fury. Marcus was staring at the geological survey map like it might spontaneously combust, while Jennifer looked like she was going to be sick. "There has to be some mistake," Patricia said finally, her voice tight with controlled desperation. "Mother wouldn't have done this. She wouldn't have given the most valuable property to someone she never even met." Mr. Walsh folded the letter carefully and handed it to me. "Mrs. Hartwell was very clear about her intentions, Mrs. Morrison. She spent months working out the details of this bequest. She wanted to ensure that Miss Reynolds would have every advantage when dealing with the oil companies." "But it's not fair," Jennifer burst out, her careful composure finally cracking. "We're the ones who took care of her. We're the ones who visited her, who helped her with her shopping, who made sure she was okay. And she gives the oil rights to someone who couldn't even be bothered to visit her own grandmother?" The accusation hit me like a physical blow, and I felt my face burning with shame and anger. "I didn't even know she existed until 6 months ago," I said, my voice shaking. "My mother told me both her parents were dead. I would have visited if I'd known." "Oh, please," Patricia snapped, her pretense of dignity finally abandoned completely. "Don't play the innocent victim. You could have reached out if you'd really wanted to. You could have looked for family connections. But you didn't bother because you figured there was nothing in it for you." The unfairness of it was breathtaking. I'd spent my entire life believing I had no extended family, no grandparents or aunts or uncles who might care about my existence. And now I was being blamed for not seeking out people who had made it clear they wanted nothing to do with me or my mother. "That's enough," Mr. Walsh said firmly, his professional demeanor taking on an edge of steel. "Mrs. Hartwell's wishes are clearly stated and legally binding. Miss Reynolds is the rightful heir to the property and all associated rights. Any challenges to the will can be made through proper legal channels, but this reading is concluded." He began gathering his papers, but Marcus leaned forward desperately. "Surely there's room for negotiation here. Family negotiations. Sarah, you seem like a reasonable person. Maybe we could work out some kind of arrangement that would be fair to everyone." I looked at him, this man who 5 minutes ago had been dismissing my inheritance as worthless desert, and felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. "What kind of arrangement?" "Well," he said, glancing at his wife and daughter, "you're young, you probably don't want to be tied down with property management and mineral rights negotiations. That's complicated business, requires experience and connections. Maybe we could take that burden off your hands, give you a fair cash settlement, and handle all the messy details ourselves." "How much?" I asked, curious to see just how far their desperation would take them. Patricia jumped in eagerly. "We could offer you $100,000 cash right now. That's more money than you've probably ever seen, Sarah. You could pay off any debts, maybe go to school, start fresh, and you wouldn't have to worry about all the legal complications of mineral rights and oil companies." $100,000. 6 hours ago, that would have seemed like an impossible fortune. Now, knowing what I knew about the real value of what I'd inherited, it felt like an insult. "According to the letter Mr. Walsh just read," I said carefully, "the last offer was $250,000 just for exploration rights. And your grandmother's analysis suggested the total value could be much higher. But that's just speculation, Jennifer said quickly. There's no guarantee there's actually oil down there. You could end up with nothing but a lot of legal headaches. 100,000 cash is a sure thing. I looked around the table at these people who shared my blood but had never shared my struggles, who had spent the last hour making it clear that they considered me beneath them, and felt a strange calm settle over me. Thank you for the offer, I said, standing up from the table. But I think I'll keep my inheritance exactly as my grandmother intended. The drive back to my apartment passed in a blur of shock and disbelief. 5 acres of Texas desert, mineral rights worth potentially millions of dollars. A grandmother who had loved me from a distance and planned my future with more care than anyone had ever shown me in my life. By the time I pulled into the parking lot of my run-down apartment complex, the enormity of what had happened was beginning to sink in. I wasn't the same person who had driven to that law office this morning. In the space of a few hours, everything had changed. But more than the money, more than the sudden reversal of fortune, was the knowledge that I had been seen and valued by someone who mattered. Evelyn Hartwell had looked at my life and seen worth, had recognized something in me that even my own relatives had missed. As I climbed the stairs to my second-floor apartment, past the peeling paint and broken mailboxes, I thought about the letter she'd left me. About being a Hartwell, about being a survivor, about turning worthless ground into something precious. I had a feeling my education in oil and gas rights was about to begin. The first phone call came at 6 in the morning, 3 days after the will reading. I fumbled for my phone in the darkness, my heart racing with the kind of panic that comes from being woken by an unexpected call. Unknown number, with a local area code. Sarah, this is your Aunt Patricia. We need to talk. Her voice was different from the controlled politeness she'd displayed at the lawyer's office. There was an urgency there, an edge that made me instantly alert despite the early hour. I sat up in bed, pulling my ratty bathrobe around my shoulders against the morning chill. It's 6 in the morning, I said, still trying to shake off the fog of sleep. I know, and I'm sorry about that, but this couldn't wait. We made a mistake yesterday, Sarah. We were in shock, grieving, not thinking clearly. That offer we made, 100,000, it was insulting. We realize that now. I found myself fully awake, fascinated despite myself by the desperation I could hear creeping into her voice. This was a woman who had spent decades managing other people's perceptions of her, who had built her identity around being respectable and in control. The cracks in that facade were showing, and it was both disturbing and oddly satisfying to witness. What do you want, Patricia? I want to make this right. Families should stick together, and we got off on the wrong foot yesterday. Marcus and I have been talking all night, and we want to present you with a real offer. Something that reflects the true value of what you've inherited. I walked to my kitchen, turning on the coffee maker with my free hand. The morning ritual helped ground me, gave me something normal to focus on, while navigating this surreal conversation with a woman who, 24 hours ago, had been laughing at my inheritance. I'm listening. $500,000. Cash. We can have the paperwork drawn up today and money transferred to your account by the end of the week. 500,000. 5 times their initial offer, and still less than the signing bonus alone that the oil company had offered my grandmother. But it was also more money than I'd ever dreamed of having. Enough to change my life completely, even if it wasn't the full value of what I'd inherited. Why? I asked. Yesterday you were convinced those 5 acres were worthless. What changed? There was a pause, and I could almost hear her choosing her words carefully. We did some research last night, looked into those geological surveys, made some phone calls. You're right that there's potential there, more potential than we initially realized. What she didn't say, but what I was beginning to understand, was that they'd probably made a lot more phone calls than just research into geological surveys. In a town this size, word traveled fast, and by now half the county probably knew that the old Hartwell homestead had mineral rights that were potentially worth millions. Their attempt to lowball me was going to look pretty shabby if word got out about the real value. The thing is, Sarah, Patricia continued, and now there was definitely pleading in her voice, managing mineral rights is complicated. There are lawyers to hire, negotiations to handle, contracts to review, you're not equipped for that kind of business. But Marcus has experience with commercial real estate. And I've managed investments for years. We could handle all of that for you, take all the stress and uncertainty off your shoulders. For $500,000. It's a guaranteed return, Sarah. No waiting, no risk, no complications. Just clean money that you can use to build whatever life you want. I poured coffee into my favorite mug, a chipped ceramic thing I'd bought at a thrift store that said, "World's Okayest Employee." The normalcy of it helped me think more clearly about what was really happening here. "I'll think about it," I said finally. "Don't think too long." Patricia's voice had sharpened again. "Opportunities like this don't last forever, and there are complications that could arise if you wait too long." "What kind of complications?" Another pause. "Legal complications. Family complications. The kind that could tie things up in court for years while lawyers get rich and everyone else suffers." The threat was veiled, but unmistakable. They were considering challenging the will, and they wanted me to know it. I felt a familiar knot form in my stomach, the same feeling I'd had countless times growing up when adults used their power to intimidate me into compliance. "I'll call you back," I said, and hung up before she could respond. The next call came from Marcus 2 hours later, just as I was getting ready to leave for my shift at the diner. His approach was different, more businesslike, the voice of a man used to closing deals. "Sarah, I hope Patricia didn't wake you too early this morning. She gets anxious when there are family matters to resolve. She mentioned $500,000. She did, and that's a serious offer. But I wanted to talk to you about the bigger picture here. See, the thing about mineral rights is that they're only valuable if you know how to leverage them properly. And frankly, no offense intended, but you don't have the background for that kind of negotiation." I locked my apartment door and started down the stairs, phone pressed to my ear. "What kind of background do you think I need?" "Well, for starters, you need lawyers who specialize in mineral rights law. Good ones cost $500 an hour, minimum. You need geological consultants to verify the surveys, environmental impact specialists, accountants who understand depletion allowances, and percentage depletion calculations. We're talking about upfront costs in the hundreds of thousands, just to get to the negotiating table." The numbers he was throwing around made my head spin. I'd never had to think about hiring lawyers and consultants, had never dealt with anything more complicated than negotiating my work schedule at the diner. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was in over my head. Plus, Marcus continued, there's no guarantee that any oil company is actually going to drill. They might lease the rights and then sit on them for years, pay you a minimal annual fee while they wait for market conditions to improve. You could end up with a few $1,000s a year instead of the big payout you're imagining. But if they do drill? If they do drill, and if they find oil, and if the market price supports extraction, and if you've negotiated a good royalty rate, then yes, you could make significant money. But that's a lot of ifs, Sarah. Our offer eliminates all those variables. I reached my car, an aging Honda with a temperamental starter and a passenger door that only opened from the inside. As I coaxed the engine to life, I found myself thinking about my grandmother's letter, about her faith in my ability to handle this inheritance wisely. I need more time to think about it. Of course. But Sarah, I want you to understand something. Family business should stay in the family. When outsiders get involved, things get complicated, people get hurt. I'd hate to see that happen to you. Another threat, this one even less subtle than Patricia's. I was beginning to understand that my newfound relatives weren't just greedy. They were desperate. Something about this situation had them scared, and scared people were dangerous. "I'll be in touch," I said, and ended the call. Work that day was a blur of coffee refills and breakfast orders, but I couldn't concentrate on anything. My mind kept drifting to geological surveys and mineral rights and the growing pressure I felt from people who wanted to take away the most valuable thing I'd ever owned. During my lunch break, I drove out to see the property that had caused all this commotion. The 5 acres sat about 10 miles outside town, accessible by a dirt road that branched off the main highway. I'd driven past this area hundreds of times over the years, but had never paid attention to the old homestead. Now, standing in the middle of what everyone kept calling worthless desert, I tried to see it through my grandmother's eyes. The foundation she'd mentioned was there, barely visible under decades of accumulated sand and tumbleweeds. It was larger than I'd expected, suggesting a substantial house had once stood here. The equipment shed was in better condition than everyone had claimed, its metal roof intact and walls still solid despite obvious age. But it was the land itself that surprised me most. It wasn't the barren wasteland I'd imagined based on everyone's descriptions. There were signs of old cultivation, remnants of fence lines and irrigation ditches that spoke of a time when this had been working farmland. Wild grass grew in patches, and I could see where careful terracing had once controlled water runoff from the slight hills that surrounded the property. My grandmother had grown up here, I realized. This wasn't just a real estate investment to her. It was the place where she'd learned to be the strong, independent woman who had researched geological surveys and planned my future from hundreds of miles away. I was still standing there, trying to imagine the house that had once sheltered my family, when I heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. A pickup truck was making its way down the dirt road, kicking up a cloud of dust in the afternoon heat. The truck pulled up beside my car, and an older man got out. He was perhaps 70, with the kind of weathered face that came from decades of outdoor work, wearing jeans and a work shirt that had seen better years. It took me a moment to recognize him as Frank Morrison, the neighbor who had received my grandmother's pickup truck at the will reading. "You must be Sarah," he said, walking over with a slight limp that suggested old injuries. "I heard you might be coming out here to take a look at the place. Mr. Morrison, right? From the lawyer's office? Call me Frank." And yes, I was there. "Your grandmother and I were neighbors for 40 years. Good woman, Evelyn. Tough as nails and twice as smart." He looked around the property with eyes that saw more than I did, pointing toward areas that meant nothing to me but clearly held significance for him. "She was born in that house," he said, nodding toward the foundation. "Built by her grandfather in 1923. Solid construction, that house. Took a tornado to finally bring it down in 87. Evelyn could have rebuilt, but by then she was living in town, and there wasn't much point." "You knew her well?" Frank smiled, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt like I was talking to someone who actually cared about my grandmother as a person rather than as a source of potential income. "Known her since we were kids. Our families farmed adjacent sections back when this was all agricultural land. Evelyn was always the smartest one of the bunch, graduated valedictorian, got a scholarship to college when most girls from around here didn't even finish high school." He walked toward the equipment shed and I followed, eager to learn more about the woman who had shaped my future from a distance. She could have gone anywhere, done anything, but she came back after college to take care of her parents. Married young, to a man who didn't deserve her, and spent 20 years trying to make that work before she finally got fed up and divorced him. This was family history I'd never heard, details that filled in the blank spaces of my grandmother's life story. What happened after the divorce? That's when she really came into her own. Started investing in real estate? Buying up properties around the county when nobody else saw their value. She had an eye for potential, could look at a piece of land and see what it might become 20 years down the road. Frank opened the door to the equipment shed, revealing an interior that was cleaner and more organized than the exterior had suggested. Tools hung neatly on wall pegboards, and there was a workbench that looked like it had been used recently. She came out here every few months, even in her 80s. Said it helped her think. Would spend hours in this shed, going through her grandfather's old tools, planning her next investment. Did she ever mention the mineral rights? Frank's expression grew more serious. Oh, she knew about those all right. Had surveyors and geologists out here more times than I can count over the past few years. Companies started sniffing around when the drilling began over near Millerville, but Evelyn wasn't interested in their first offers. Why not? Because she was smart enough to know that first offers are never best offers, and because she wanted to make sure whoever inherited this place would be in a position to negotiate from strength. He looked at me directly, his eyes kind but serious. "She talked about you, you know. Last few years especially. Worried about you, regretted the family split that kept you apart." The knowledge that my grandmother had thought about me, worried about me, made my throat tight with emotion. I didn't even know she existed until recently. She knew that, Blamed herself for letting pride and old hurts keep the family divided. Said the mineral rights were her way of making sure you'd have choices in life, the kind of choices she'd never had when she was young. Frank closed the shed door and leaned against it, studying me with the assessing gaze of someone who'd spent decades evaluating character. I suppose your aunt and uncle have been calling. How did you know? Because Patricia Morrison has been pestering me for 3 days, trying to get me to tell her what I know about those geological surveys. Marcus drove out here yesterday, said he wanted to look around for sentimental reasons, but I saw him taking pictures and measuring distances. The idea that they were already investigating the property, already making plans, made me angry in a way I hadn't expected. This land had been my grandmother's sanctuary, the place she'd come to think and plan, and now they were treating it like a commodity to be evaluated and exploited. They made me an offer, I said. $500,000 for everything. Frank snorted, a sound of derision that perfectly conveyed his opinion of that offer. $500,000. For mineral rights that could be worth 20 times that much. Did they mention that Lone Star Energy has been drilling test wells about 3 miles from here, and every one of them has come up positive? My heart stopped. Positive? Oil? Gas? Both. Good quality reserves at manageable depths. The geological formation that runs under their drilling sites extends right through this property. That's why the energy companies have been so interested. 20 times 500,000, $10 million. The number was so large it felt abstract, impossible, like something that happened to other people in stories but never in real life. There's something else you should know, Frank continued. Yesterday afternoon I saw Patricia's car, parked outside the county courthouse. Then Marcus's car an hour later. If I had to guess, I'd say they're looking into challenging your grandmother's will. The knot in my stomach tightened. Can they do that? They can try. Might claim your grandmother wasn't mentally competent when she wrote the will, or that someone influenced her improperly. It's hard to prove, but it could tie things up in court for years. Expensive years. I felt trapped suddenly, caught between the complexity of managing mineral rights myself and the certainty that my relatives were trying to cheat me out of my inheritance. Every option seemed to carry enormous risks, and I had no experience navigating this kind of high-stakes situation. What would my grandmother have done? Frank smiled again, the same kind expression I'd seen when he'd accepted his modest inheritance at the will reading. She would have gotten herself educated. Would have learned everything there was to know about mineral rights and oil extraction and contract negotiation. Then she would have found the best lawyer in the state and made sure she got every penny she was owed. But the upfront costs Marcus mentioned are real, but not as prohibitive as he made them sound. Good mineral rights attorneys often work on contingency fees, meaning they get paid out of your eventual settlement. And there are ways to structure deals so the oil companies cover most of the geological and legal costs. Frank pulled a business card from his wallet, handing it to me. This is Tom Bradley, attorney in Houston. Specializes in mineral rights. Represented me when I leased my mineral rights 15 years ago. Got me twice what the first company offered. Honest man, knows the business inside and out. I looked at the card, feeling like I was holding a lifeline. Did my grandmother know about him? She did. In fact, she asked me for his contact information about 6 months ago. Said she wanted to make sure you'd have the right guidance when the time came. Even from beyond the grave, my grandmother was still looking out for me, still planning and preparing for my future. The realization that she'd thought so far ahead, that she'd anticipated the challenges I would face and provided solutions, made me feel less alone than I had since walking out of that law office. There's one more thing, Frank said as we walked back toward our vehicles. Whatever you decide to do, decide quickly. Word is getting around about your inheritance, and there are people besides your relatives who might try to take advantage of someone they think doesn't know the value of what they've got. What do you mean? Mineral rights speculators, mostly. People who make a living buying rights from folks who don't know what they're worth, then flipping them to the oil companies for huge profits. They prey on people in situations like yours, people who've inherited something valuable but don't understand the business. As if summoned by his words, another vehicle appeared on the dirt road. This one was a luxury sedan, black and polished, completely out of place in this rural setting. It pulled up beside Frank's truck, and 2 men in expensive suits got out. "Miss Reynolds?" The older of the 2 men approached with the kind of confident smile that immediately put me on guard. "I'm Richard Blackwood from Texas Mineral Acquisitions. We heard about your recent inheritance, and we'd like to discuss a business proposition with you." Frank's expression had hardened, and he stepped slightly closer to me in a gesture that felt protective. "Sarah, these are exactly the kind of people I was warning you about." "Now, Frank," Blackwood said smoothly, "no need for hostility. We're just here to offer Miss Reynolds a fair deal for property that could otherwise become a real headache for her." The younger man, who looked like he might have played college football before discovering that expensive suits paid better, opened a briefcase and pulled out a thick document. "We're prepared to offer you $750,000 for a complete transfer of all mineral rights," Blackwood continued. "Cash deal, no contingencies, we handle all the paperwork and legal requirements. You could walk away today with more money than most people see in a lifetime. $750,000. Even more than my relatives had offered, and these were complete strangers who had somehow learned about my inheritance within days of the will reading. If they were offering that much, the rights had to be worth significantly more. "How did you know about my inheritance?" I asked. "Word travels fast in the mineral rights business," Blackwood replied evasively. "Point is, we're here with cash in hand, ready to take a complicated situation off your hands and put serious money in your bank account." Frank stepped forward. "Sarah doesn't need to make any decisions today. In fact, she'd be smart to get legal advice before considering any offers." Blackwood's smile never wavered, but something cold flashed in his eyes. "Legal advice is expensive, Frank, and time-consuming. Miss Reynolds looks like a smart young woman who can recognize a good opportunity when she sees one. The opportunity is keeping the mineral rights and negotiating her own deals with the oil companies," Frank replied firmly. "Not selling them for a fraction of their value to speculators. That's assuming the oil companies are actually interested." The younger man spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a subtle threat. "Mineral rights are only valuable if someone wants to drill. Markets change, companies go out of business, environmental regulations shift. Our offer guarantees Miss Reynolds a substantial return with no risk." I looked back and forth between Frank and the 2 strangers, feeling the weight of everyone's expectations and agendas. These men had driven out here specifically to pressure me into a quick decision, which told me everything I needed to know about whether their offer was fair. "I'm not making any decisions today," I said finally. "I need time to research my options and get proper advice." Blackwood's expression flickered with annoyance before the practiced smile returned. Of course. But I hope you understand that opportunities like this don't last forever. Market conditions change, and we might not be able to make the same offer if you wait too long." He handed me a business card with gold lettering and an embossed logo. "Call me when you're ready to move forward, but don't wait too long, Miss Reynolds." In this business, timing is everything. They got back in their sedan and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and the lingering sense that I'd just been threatened in the politest possible way. "How many more people like that am I going to have to deal with?" I asked Frank. "Probably quite a few once word really gets out. That's why your grandmother was so careful about keeping things quiet while she was alive. She knew that as soon as people realized the value of those mineral rights, you'd become a target for every speculator and fast-talking businessman in Texas." I looked around the property again, this patch of land that had suddenly become the center of so much attention and conflict. My grandmother had stood in this same spot, had looked at these same hills and foundations, and had seen not just the potential for oil and gas extraction, but the potential for her granddaughter's future. What would happen if I just kept the land and didn't lease the mineral rights to anyone? Frank considered this seriously. "You could do that. Hold on to them indefinitely, wait for better offers or better market conditions. But there are carrying costs, property taxes, and you'd miss out on income that could change your life right now. And if I do lease them? If you get good representation and negotiate smart terms, you could end up with enough money to never worry about financial security again. Plus royalty payments for as long as they're extracting oil and gas, which could be decades. As we drove back toward town in our separate vehicles, I found myself thinking about my grandmother's letter, about her faith in my ability to handle this inheritance wisely. She'd spent years researching and planning, had provided me with resources and connections, had set up every possible advantage. But ultimately, the decision was mine to make. And whatever I chose would determine not just my financial future, but the kind of person I was going to become. Would I let myself be pressured into a quick sale by relatives who had dismissed me? Or would I have the courage to fight for what was rightfully mine? By the time I reached my apartment, I had made up my mind. I was going to call Tom Bradley, the lawyer Frank had recommended. I was going to learn everything there was to know about mineral rights and oil extraction and contract negotiation. And I was going to make my grandmother proud. The phone calls from my relatives continued over the next few days, each one more desperate than the last. Patricia called twice more, raising their offer to $600,000, then $700,000. Marcus left voicemails with increasingly dire warnings about the legal and financial complications I would face if I tried to manage the mineral rights myself. Jennifer surprised me by showing up at the diner during my evening shift, sliding into a booth in my section with an expression that suggested she was doing me an enormous favor by breathing the same air as the paying customers. "We need to talk," she said without preamble when I approached her table. "I'm working." "This is more important than coffee refills, Sarah. Our family is falling apart because of this situation." I set down the coffee pot I'd been carrying and looked at her directly. "Your family seems to be doing just fine. It's only falling apart because you're not getting what you want. What I want is what's fair. What we all want is what's fair." Grandmother was clearly not thinking straight when she wrote that will. Nobody gives the most valuable piece of property to someone they've never met. She was thinking perfectly clearly. She spent years planning this. Jennifer's carefully constructed composure began to crack. Years planning to screw over the people who actually took care of her, who visited her every week, who helped her with her groceries and her doctor's appointments. "We earned those mineral rights, Sarah. We put in the time and effort. And you got your inheritance. The house, the commercial building, the antiques. You just didn't get mine. Your inheritance is worth 10 times everything else combined, and you know it. So you're angry that your grandmother was more generous to me than to you. Maybe you should ask yourself why that might be." Jennifer's eyes flashed with a fury that made her look remarkably like her mother. "Don't you dare act superior to me. You're a diner waitress with a high school education who got lucky. We're offering you more money than you'll ever see again in your life, and you're too stupid to take it." The insult hung in the air between us, and I felt that familiar shame trying to rise up, the voice that had whispered throughout my childhood that I wasn't good enough, wasn't smart enough, wasn't worth the same consideration as other people. But this time, I also heard my grandmother's voice from her letter, telling me I was a Hartwell. That Hartwells were survivors who found ways to turn worthless ground into something precious. "You're right," I said quietly. "I am a diner waitress with a high school education, but I'm also smart enough to recognize when someone is trying to cheat me out of millions of dollars." "Millions?" Jennifer laughed, but there was hysteria in it. "You're living in a fantasy, Sarah. There's no guarantee there are millions of dollars down there." "Then why are you so desperate to buy the rights from me?" She couldn't answer that, because we both knew the truth. They weren't offering me hundreds of thousands of dollars out of kindness or family loyalty. They were doing it because they knew the mineral rights were worth much more, and they wanted to be the ones to profit from them. "The offer expires tomorrow," Jennifer said finally, sliding out of the booth. "After that, you're on your own. And when the lawyers start circling and the legal bills start mounting, remember that we tried to help you." After she left, I stood in the middle of the diner, surrounded by the familiar sounds of clinking dishes and casual conversation, and made my final decision. I pulled out the business card Frank had given me and dialed Tom Bradley's number. "Mr. Bradley? This is Sarah Reynolds. I think I need your help." Tom Bradley's office in Houston was everything I'd expected, and nothing like I'd imagined. The building itself was impressive, 40 floors of gleaming glass and steel in the heart of the business district. But Bradley's office on the 28th floor felt more like a comfortable library than a corporate boardroom. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, legal journals mixed with geological texts and what appeared to be genuine first editions of classic literature. The man himself was perhaps 60. With silver hair and the kind of weathered hands that suggested he'd spent time in oil fields before becoming a lawyer. When he stood to greet me, his handshake was firm but not aggressive, and his smile reached his eyes in a way that reminded me of Frank Morrison's genuine warmth. "Miss Reynolds, Frank Morrison spoke very highly of you when he called to arrange this meeting. Please have a seat and tell me about your situation." I'd driven the 3 hours to Houston with a mixture of nervousness and determination, carrying a folder containing every document from the will reading, along with my grandmother's letter. The city traffic had been overwhelming, the parking garage fees astronomical by my standards, and I'd felt completely out of place in the marble lobby of Bradley's building. But sitting across from him now, I felt some of my anxiety beginning to ease. I inherited mineral rights that apparently everyone wants to buy from me. I began, then found myself telling him the entire story. The will reading, my relatives, increasingly desperate offers, the visit from the mineral rights speculators, even the threatening phone calls that had continued right up until I'd left town that morning. Bradley listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad, his expression growing more serious as I described the pressure tactics being used against me. "How much do you know about the oil and gas industry?" he asked when I finished. "Nothing. Until a week ago, I didn't even know people could own mineral rights separately from surface rights." That's honest, and it's a good starting point. The first thing you need to understand is that you're sitting on what could be one of the most valuable, privately held mineral rights parcels in this part of Texas. The geological surveys your grandmother commissioned were very thorough, and the results are extremely promising. He pulled out a map from his desk drawer, spreading it across the surface so I could see the detailed markings. "This shows all the drilling activity in your area over the past 5 years. See these red dots? Those are successful wells, all of them producing significant quantities of oil and natural gas." The map was covered with red dots, forming a pattern that seemed to be moving steadily toward my grandmother's property. And the blue dots? Dry holes or wells that weren't economically viable. As you can see, there are very few of those in your area. The success rate has been over 90%, which is remarkable in this business. Bradley traced a line on the map with his finger, showing how the geological formation extended directly under my 5 acres. "Based on the data I've reviewed, I estimate the total recoverable reserves under your property could be worth anywhere from $8 to $15 million at current market prices." The numbers still felt surreal, like we were discussing someone else's life. The speculators offered me $750,000, which would give them a profit of at least 10 times their investment, probably more. Your relatives' offers are even worse, barely 5% of the actual value. Why would they lowball me so dramatically if they know what it's worth? Bradley leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "Because they're counting on your inexperience and their ability to pressure you into a quick decision. It's a common tactic, unfortunately. Make the person feel overwhelmed and out of their depth, then offer what seems like a lot of money to make the complexity go away. Can they actually challenge the will successfully? It's possible but unlikely. Your grandmother was clearly competent when she wrote the will, she had excellent legal representation, and her intentions were explicitly stated. A challenge would be expensive and time-consuming, and they'd probably lose, but they might try it anyway, hoping to pressure you into settling rather than fighting." Bradley opened another file folder, pulling out what appeared to be a contract template. "The good news is that several major oil companies have been waiting for an opportunity to lease rights in your area. I've already had preliminary conversations with 3 different companies since Frank called me yesterday. You've been talking to oil companies about my property? With your permission, I'd like to set up formal meetings with all the interested parties. Let them make their best offers, then negotiate the most favorable terms possible. Based on what I'm hearing, you could be looking at a signing bonus of at least $2 million, plus royalty payments of 18 to 25% of all oil and gas extracted. $2 million just to sign a lease. Royalty payments that could continue for decades. It was more money than I could have imagined, but it also felt like stepping into a world I didn't understand and couldn't control. What are the risks? The main risk is that I'm wrong about the reserves, that the geological surveys are overly optimistic. But given the success rate of surrounding wells and the quality of your grandmother's research, I think that risk is minimal." Bradley paused, studying my expression. "The bigger risk might be the pressure you're already facing from people who want to prevent you from getting fair value for your inheritance. As if summoned by his words, my phone began buzzing with a call from Marcus. I declined it, but it immediately started ringing again. "That's been happening all morning," I told Bradley. "They're not taking no for an answer." Have any of their communications felt threatening? I thought about Jennifer's visit to the diner, about the thinly veiled warnings about legal complications and expensive battles. Not directly threatening, but definitely intimidating. Bradley made another note. "We'll document everything going forward. If they escalate their pressure tactics, we may need to consider a restraining order." The idea that I might need legal protection from my own relatives was both frightening and absurd. 6 months ago, I'd been alone in the world, with no family connections at all. Now I had relatives who wanted to steal my inheritance and might be willing to use intimidation to get it. How long would the whole process take? If we move quickly and efficiently, we could have lease agreements signed within 60 to 90 days. The key is controlling the narrative and not letting anyone pressure you into premature decisions. Bradley stood up, walking to his window that overlooked the Houston skyline. "Miss Reynolds, in 30 years of practicing mineral rights law, I've seen a lot of people in situations similar to yours. The ones who do well are the ones who educate themselves, stay patient, and don't let fear drive their decisions. And the ones who don't do well usually sell too quickly for too little money, because they let other people convince them they're not capable of handling the complexity. Your grandmother clearly believed you were capable. Frank Morrison believes you're capable. The question is whether you believe it." I looked around his office again, taking in the law books and geological surveys, the framed photographs of oil derricks and successful negotiations. This was a world my grandmother had researched and understood. A world she'd intended for me to navigate with confidence. "What's the next step?" Bradley smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "The next step is education. I'm going to give you some materials to read about mineral rights law and oil extraction processes. Then we're going to set up meetings with the oil companies and let them compete for the right to lease your property." He pulled several thick binders from his bookshelf, setting them on the desk in front of me. "This might seem overwhelming at first, but you're smarter than you think. Your grandmother saw that, and so do I." As I gathered the materials and prepared to leave, Bradley made one final point that would stick with me throughout the battles to come. "Remember, Miss Reynolds, you're not asking anyone for a favor. You own something valuable and they want to buy it from you. That puts you in the position of strength, not weakness. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The drive back to my small town gave me time to process everything Bradley had told me. The numbers were staggering, almost impossible to believe, but the evidence seemed solid. My grandmother hadn't just left me a valuable inheritance. She'd left me the foundation for financial independence that could last for generations. But first, I had to survive the next few months of pressure and intimidation from people who seemed determined to take that future away from me. When I pulled into my apartment complex that evening, I immediately noticed Marcus's BMW parked near the entrance. He was sitting in the driver's seat, clearly waiting for me to return. The sight of him sitting there like a predator waiting for prey made my heart race with anxiety and anger. I parked as far from his car as possible and walked quickly toward my building, keys ready in my hand. But Marcus got out of his car and intercepted me before I could reach the entrance. "Sarah, we need to talk. You're making a serious mistake." "I don't want to talk to you, Marcus. Please leave me alone." "You went to Houston today." "To see a lawyer." It wasn't a question, and the certainty in his voice made me wonder if they'd been having me followed. "That's none of your business." "Everything about this situation is our business. That property has been in our family for generations, and we're not going to let some ambulance-chasing attorney convince you to make decisions that will hurt everyone." I stopped walking and turned to face him directly. "Hurt everyone? Or hurt your chances of cheating me out of millions of dollars?" Marcus's expression darkened. "Millions of dollars? Is that what this shark is telling you? Sarah, you're being played. These lawyers will promise you the moon, then take half of everything in fees and leave you with nothing but legal bills. Tom Bradley works on contingency. He doesn't get paid unless I get paid. And what percentage is he taking? 30%? 40%? plus expenses that could run into the hundreds of thousands? I realized I hadn't actually discussed Bradley's fee structure in detail, but I wasn't about to admit that to Marcus. His fees are reasonable and clearly spelled out. Look, Sarah. Marcus's tone shifted, becoming more conciliatory. We're family. We want what's best for you. But you're in over your head here, dealing with people who see you as an easy mark. Our offer stands, $750,000, cash. No lawyers, no complications. Your offer is insulting. Our offer is realistic. And it's guaranteed money that you can have in your bank account next week. What your lawyer is promising is a gamble that could leave you with nothing. I walked past him toward my building entrance, but he followed, his voice becoming more urgent. Think about what you're risking, Sarah. If this goes to court, if there are challenges to the will, if the oil companies change their minds or the market crashes, you could end up worse off than when you started. But if you take our offer, you're set for life. I turned around one final time before entering my building. Marcus, I've thought about it very carefully, and I've decided that I'd rather risk losing everything, fighting for what's fair, than guarantee losing everything by accepting what's not. His expression shifted again, back to something colder and more calculating. You're making enemies you can't afford to have, Sarah. This town is smaller than you think, and people have long memories. The threat was unmistakable now, no longer hidden behind family concern or financial advice. I was being warned that crossing my relatives would have consequences beyond the immediate dispute over mineral rights. Are you threatening me? I'm trying to protect you from making a mistake that will follow you for the rest of your life. I went inside and locked the door behind me, but I could see through the glass that Marcus remained in the parking lot for several more minutes, talking on his phone with obvious agitation. That night, as I tried to focus on the materials Bradley had given me, my phone rang constantly. Different numbers, some local, some from area codes I didn't recognize, but when I answered, the callers all seemed to know about my inheritance and wanted to discuss opportunities for quick sales. By midnight, I'd stopped answering the phone entirely, but the calls continued until well past 2 in the morning. Someone was spreading the word about my situation, making sure I understood that privacy and quiet contemplation weren't going to be options. The next morning brought a new challenge. When I arrived at Miller's Diner for my shift, the manager, Carol, was waiting with an expression I'd never seen before. Sarah, we need to talk. My office, now. Carol's office was a cramped space behind the kitchen, barely large enough for a desk and 2 chairs. She gestured for me to sit, then closed the door with more force than necessary. I got a call yesterday from someone asking about your work history, your reliability, your character. They said they were considering offering you a job and wanted references. My stomach dropped. What did you tell them? I told them the truth, that you're one of the best employees I've ever had. But Sarah, that wasn't really why they were calling. They were fishing for information, trying to find out what kind of person you are, whether you're responsible with money, whether you make good decisions. The realization that someone was investigating me, building a case for why I couldn't be trusted with my own inheritance, made me feel violated and vulnerable. Who was it? They didn't say, but the number had a local area code. Whoever it was knew a lot about your situation already. Carol leaned forward, her expression concerned. Sarah, I don't know what's going on with you lately, but people are talking. There are rumors about some kind of inheritance, about family disputes, about lawyers from Houston. I inherited some property from my grandmother. My relatives don't think I should keep it. Carol studied my face carefully. Is it valuable? Very valuable. Valuable enough that people might try to hurt you to get it? The question hung in the air between us, and I realized that Carol was genuinely worried about my safety. The pressure tactics my relatives were using weren't just annoying, they were escalating in ways that could become genuinely dangerous. I don't know. I hope not. Sarah, I've been in this business for 20 years, and I've seen what money does to people. It brings out the worst in families, turns relatives into enemies. You need to be careful. As if to emphasize her point, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Last chance for easy money. After today, things get complicated. I showed the message to Carol, whose expression grew even more concerned. Honey, you need to call the police. This is harassment. Maybe even extortion. It's family business. Family business doesn't involve anonymous threats. Sarah, promise me you'll be careful. And if you need time off to deal with this situation, you've got it. The fact that even my boss could see the danger in my situation made me realize how serious things had become. I wasn't just negotiating a business deal. I was fighting for my safety and my future against people who seemed willing to use any means necessary to get what they wanted. But I also remembered Tom Bradley's words about being in a position of strength, about owning something valuable that others wanted to buy. My grandmother had faced down decades of challenges and obstacles to build her success. She'd believed I could do the same. I just had to stay strong long enough to prove her right. The call from Tom Bradley came at dawn 3 weeks later, his voice crackling with excitement through my phone's speaker as I fumbled to answer without fully waking up. Sarah, we've got them. Pacific Energy just made an offer that changes everything. I sat up in bed, instantly alert despite the early hour. What kind of offer? $3.5 million signing bonus, plus 22% royalties on all extracted oil and gas. They want exclusive drilling rights to your entire parcel, and they're willing to guarantee minimum annual payments of $50,000, even if they don't extract anything. The numbers hit me like a physical force. $3.5 million just for signing a piece of paper. I'd been working minimum wage jobs my entire adult life, calculating whether I could afford groceries or had to choose between food and rent. Now someone was offering me more money than I could spend in a lifetime. Is it a good offer? It's an excellent offer. Better than I expected, honestly. But here's the thing. We've got 2 other companies that want to bid, and when they hear about Pacific's terms, this could turn into a real auction. I walked to my kitchen window, looking out at the parking lot where I'd seen Marcus waiting for me just days earlier. Everything felt surreal, like I was living someone else's life where million-dollar decisions were made over morning coffee. What's the timeline? Pacific wants an answer within 72 hours. They're planning to begin drilling operations next month on adjacent properties. And they want your mineral rights secured before they start. But Sarah, we need to meet in person to go over all the details. This is too important to handle over the phone. I can drive to Houston today. Actually, I'm already in your area. I drove up last night to meet with some of the other companies. How about we get together at your grandmother's property this morning? I think it would be appropriate to make this decision on the land that's going to change your life. 2 hours later, I was standing in the same spot where I'd first met Frank Morrison, watching Tom Bradley's pickup truck navigate the dirt road that led to my inheritance. He'd traded his business suit for jeans and work boots, looking more like a rancher than a lawyer as he stepped out of his vehicle carrying a briefcase and what appeared to be surveying equipment. The land looks different when you know what's underneath it, he said, gesturing toward the seemingly empty expanse of scrub brush and rocky soil. Those hills there. The way the ground slopes, it's all indicators of the geological formations we're dealing with. He spread several documents on the tailgate of his truck, weighting them down with rocks against the morning breeze. Pacific Energy's offer is comprehensive, but there are details we need to discuss. First, they want to drill multiple wells on your property, which means more disruption, but also potentially higher yields. I studied the contract language, most of which might as well have been written in a foreign language. Terms like pooling agreements and depletion allowances covered pages of dense legal text that would determine my financial future. What about environmental concerns? Modern drilling techniques are much cleaner than they used to be, and Texas law requires comprehensive restoration of the surface land once extraction is complete. Plus, the royalty structure means you'll continue earning income for decades, so the companies have incentives to maintain good relationships with landowners. Bradley pulled out a calculator and began running numbers, showing me potential income scenarios based on different extraction rates and market prices. Even conservative estimates suggested annual royalty payments in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, continuing for 20 to 30 years. There's something else, he said, his expression becoming more serious. I've been hearing rumors about your relatives. Word is they're planning something desperate to try to force you into selling to them instead of leasing to the oil companies. What kind of something? I'm not sure, but my advice is to be extra careful for the next few days. Don't meet with any of them alone, and document any contact they attempt to make. As if summoned by our conversation, I noticed a familiar vehicle approaching down the dirt road. Patricia's Mercedes was making its way toward us, moving faster than was safe on the rough terrain. "Speak of the devil," Bradley muttered, gathering up the contracts and sliding them back into his briefcase. Patricia's car pulled up in a cloud of dust, and she got out wearing an expression of barely controlled fury. She was dressed inappropriately for the setting. High heels and a business suit that belonged in an office building, rather than on a dirt road in rural Texas. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she demanded, marching toward us with her hands clenched into fists. "I'm meeting with my attorney on my property," I replied as calmly as I could manage. "Your property? Sarah, this is family land. It's been in our family for generations, and you have no right to bring in outsiders to destroy it." Bradley stepped forward, his demeanor professional but firm. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm Tom Bradley, Miss Reynolds, legal counsel. I understand you have concerns, but this is a private meeting on private property." "I know exactly who you are," Patricia snapped. "You're a vulture who preys on vulnerable people, convincing them to make decisions they're not equipped to handle. The only vulnerable person I see here is someone being pressured by relatives who want to cheat her out of millions of dollars." Patricia's face went red with rage. "Millions of dollars? You're filling her head with fantasies. There's no guarantee there's oil down there, no guarantee these companies will actually drill, no guarantee she'll see a penny of the money you're promising." "Actually," Bradley said, pulling out his phone, "I have 3 separate geological surveys that disagree with you, plus successful drilling results from every adjacent property. The oil is there, Mrs. Morrison. The question is who's going to profit from it. We're offering her guaranteed money. Cash in hand, no risks, no complications. You're offering her lawyers' promises and pipe dreams." I found my voice, stepping between them before the confrontation could escalate further. "Patricia, I've made my decision. I'm not selling the mineral rights to you or anyone else. I'm leasing them to an oil company that will pay me fair value." "Fair value? Sarah, you don't understand what you're getting into. These oil companies will eat you alive. They'll tie you up in contracts you don't understand, drill wherever they want on your land, destroy the environment, and when they're done, they'll walk away and leave you with a contaminated wasteland." "That's not how modern mineral rights leases work," Bradley interjected. "Sarah will retain surface rights and environmental protections, plus substantial financial compensation." Patricia turned her attention back to me, her expression shifting from anger to something that looked almost like desperation. "Sarah, please, think about what you're doing to our family. This inheritance should benefit all of us, not just you. We could work together, pool our resources, maybe even start our own drilling operation." "With what money?" I asked. "You want me to sell you my mineral rights for a fraction of their value, then partner with you to develop them? That doesn't make any sense. It makes perfect sense if you care about family." "Family?" The word came out louder than I'd intended, months of frustration and hurt finally boiling over. "You people didn't even know I existed until last month. You never visited my mother when she was dying, never sent a card or made a phone call. And now you want to talk about family because there's money involved?" Patricia's expression hardened. "Your mother made her choices when she married that worthless mechanic and cut herself off from her family. We had nothing to do with that. My father wasn't worthless. He was a good man who worked hard and loved his family. And my mother didn't cut herself off from anyone. You people made it clear she wasn't welcome because she didn't marry money. That's not true." "It is true. And now you're trying to do the same thing to me, making me feel like I don't deserve my inheritance because I don't live up to your standards." Bradley placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, a reminder to stay calm. "Mrs. Morrison, I think this conversation has run its course. Miss Reynolds has made her decision, and it's final." Patricia looked back and forth between us, her face cycling through anger, frustration, and something that might have been fear. "This isn't over," she said finally. "You're making a mistake that will destroy our family and hurt everyone involved." She turned and walked back to her car, but before getting in, she called out one final warning. "Sarah, when this all falls apart, when these oil companies abandon you and the lawyers take everything you have, don't come crying to us for help. Her Mercedes roared to life and disappeared down the dirt road, leaving another cloud of dust and the lingering sense that I'd just crossed a line from which there was no return. "Well," Bradley said after she was gone, "that was illuminating." "Illuminating how?" "She's terrified." People don't get that emotional about business deals unless they're afraid of losing something important. Your relatives aren't just being greedy, Sarah. They're desperate. Desperate enough to do something dangerous? Bradley considered this carefully. Possibly. We should definitely take precautions. But here's the thing. Their desperation is actually good news for you. It means they know exactly how valuable your mineral rights are, which confirms that we're making the right decision. He pulled the contracts back out of his briefcase, spreading them on his truck's tailgate again. "So what do you think about Pacific Energy's offer?" I looked around the property one more time, imagining oil derricks and drilling equipment, imagining the transformation that was about to take place. My grandmother had stood in this same spot and seen not just empty land, but potential for her granddaughter's future. I think my grandmother would be proud. I think she would be too. Should we call Pacific Energy and accept their offer? The moment felt monumental, like standing at the edge of a cliff before jumping into unknown territory. But I also felt something I'd never experienced before, the certainty that I was making a decision from a position of strength rather than desperation. "Let's call them." Bradley dialed the number while I stood there, trying to process the reality that I was about to become a millionaire. The conversation was brief, professional, focused on logistics and timeline rather than celebration. "It's done," he said after hanging up. "Contracts will be ready for signature tomorrow morning. The signing bonus will be transferred to your account within 48 hours. $3.5 million. In 2 days I would have more money than I'd ever dreamed possible, plus the promise of ongoing royalty payments that could continue for decades." But as we gathered our paperwork and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. My relatives weren't going to accept this decision quietly, and I had no idea how far they might be willing to go to change the outcome. The next 24 hours would determine whether my newfound wealth would bring freedom or just a different kind of prison. The bank manager's face was priceless when the wire transfer hit my account. $3.5 million appearing overnight in an account that had never held more than $800. She called me personally to verify the transaction, her voice a mixture of professional courtesy and barely concealed amazement. "Miss Reynolds, we've received what appears to be a very substantial deposit. Would you like to schedule an appointment to discuss investment options?" Investment options, wealth management, terms I'd never had reason to learn, were suddenly my new reality. But more than the money itself was what it represented. Vindication, independence, and proof that my grandmother's faith in me hadn't been misplaced. The drilling began 6 weeks later. I watched from my grandmother's old equipment shed as crews arrived with massive trucks and specialized equipment, transforming the quiet desert landscape into a bustling industrial operation. The noise was tremendous at first, but somehow comforting. It was the sound of my future taking shape. My relatives' legal challenge lasted exactly 3 months before their attorneys advised them to drop it. Without any evidence of mental incompetence or undue influence, their case had no merit. The mounting legal fees were eating into their own inheritances, and their lawyer finally convinced them they were throwing good money after bad. Patricia made one final attempt at reconciliation, calling to invite me to Christmas dinner. Her voice was strained but polite, as if we could simply pretend the last year hadn't happened. I declined graciously but firmly. Some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt. Frank Morrison stopped by regularly to check on the drilling progress, sharing stories about my grandmother and the changes he'd witnessed over his decades in the area. He never asked about the money, never treated me differently, and his friendship became one of the most valuable parts of my inheritance. The first royalty check arrived exactly 1 year after that morning in the lawyer's office. $460,000 for 3 months of oil extraction. Tom Bradley called to congratulate me and to discuss expanding the operation to include natural gas extraction, which could double the annual returns. I quit my job at Miller's Diner, but not before giving Carol a month's notice and a generous bonus. She cried when I told her I was leaving, not because she was losing an employee, but because she was genuinely happy about my good fortune. Some people, I learned, actually celebrate others, Success without expecting anything in return. The house I bought wasn't a mansion. I chose a comfortable ranch-style home on the edge of town with a view of the hills where my grandmother had grown up. It had space for an office where I could manage my investments and philanthropic activities, and a large kitchen where I could cook for the friends who had supported me through the difficult months. I established a scholarship fund in my grandmother's name for students from working-class families who wanted to pursue education in geology or business. Every year, I meet with the recipients personally, sharing the lesson my grandmother taught me, that sometimes the most worthless-looking ground can yield the greatest treasures. My relatives and I maintain a polite distance now. We see each other occasionally at community events, exchange brief pleasantries, and go our separate ways. They're comfortable but not wealthy. I'm wealthy, but more importantly, I'm free. The oil wells continue producing, the royalty checks continue arriving, and my grandmother's investment in my future continues paying dividends she could never have imagined. But the greatest gift she gave me wasn't the money. It was the knowledge that I was worthy of love, respect, and consideration from someone who mattered. Every morning I drive past the property where it all began. The drilling equipment is gone now, replaced by discreet pump jacks that work quietly in the desert sun. The old foundation, where my grandmother's childhood home once stood, is still there, but now it's surrounded by the evidence of dreams fulfilled and promises kept. Sometimes I stand in that spot and imagine her as a young woman, looking out at the same hills and planning her escape from limitations others tried to impose on her. She couldn't have known that her careful investments and stubborn independence would one day transform her granddaughter's life, but somehow I think she hoped they would. The land that everyone assumed was worthless turned out to be priceless. Just like the granddaughter they never bothered to know. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.